Are Kyrie Irving and the Brooklyn Nets coming close to settling on a contract extension for the Brooklyn superstar? Is this the right move for both sides? Is this to be expected? Could we have seen this coming? What does it mean for the Brooklyn Nets? What does it mean for Kyrie Irving? We're going to get all into it. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast and the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Thank you for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day, free and available on all of those great podcast platforms, YouTube as well. Like I said, keeping it free for you. You keep hanging with us every single day, talking the Brooklyn Nets. I am Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR.com. If you need some projections for FanDuel and or DraftKings, go head on over to DFSR.com. That's daily fantasy sports rankings. If you want to type out all those keys in your keypad, got you covered over there. No Adam Armbrecht today, the host of the One Giant podcast. He we'll be back tomorrow talking some more stuff. Got some trade value stuff that I know he's getting psyched about. So no Adam Armbrecht on the podcast today. That's fine. We got tons to talk about we won't even bury the lead. Talked about it a little bit in the just the open there. That Kyrie Irving, there's new reporting that this is specifically comes from Brian Lewis over at the New York Post. Came out with an article late yesterday, late in the early morning hours. I guess it was like late Monday night into Tuesday. And I'll just the headline says it all signs pointing to Kyrie Irving returning to the Nets. So Brian Lewis, New York Post, gets this, has it sourced from a couple different sources. One he names. One, he just, says it's a source with inside league offices, that all signs now are pointing to Kyrie Irving re-signing with the Brooklyn Nets this offseason. There's, some speculation around how that contract could take shape. There are a couple different options for it, which we'll get to shortly. But in terms of just a macro level piece of news reporting, it's hard to say we're too surprised by this, right? We've been through this a few times on a couple other podcasts, really since the offseason started, around where the situation with Kyrie Irving sat with the Brooklyn Nets, where the two sides sat, where they, what they both kind of need from each other, where, the value for Kyrie Irving is maybe league wide, how the Nets see him, but also what are the fundamental or realistic replacements if Kyrie Irving weren't to re-sign. And when you look at all that stuff, you kind of it kind of began to crystallize that really in the end, this was going to be a Kyrie Irving is going to be back with the Brooklyn Nets. I think some of the more of the questions surrounded what do the contracts look like? What does the timeline look like? Does he opt in and then get, sign a contract? Does he opt out and sign a contract? We'll go through a couple of the different things that could happen. In terms of numbers and years. But really what it boiled down to, or what does boil down to, is that Kyrie Irving staying on the Nets makes the most sense for both sides. And this is why we had speculated pretty confidently that this is kind of how it would end up. Again, the one report from the New York Post, Brian Lewis, is great. It's not that. This is not official, though. So we can't say this is an official signing right now. It's just that it kind of just checks a box along a timeline that I think most of us that stay pretty close to the situation understand that Kyrie Irving, even with some posturing, even with some, messaging from the front office and Sean Marks around, possibly, want players that are going to be here, and some of the talk that he gave in one of his outgoing press conferences at the end of the season, even with that talk, it all kind of still that more felt like maybe pre-negotiating. It felt more, and we said it at the time, felt like, maybe, like I said, some posturing, some messaging, hey, we'll send you a little message here about what we want to happen going forward, without it being really feeling like it was going to be a hard line in the sand, that this was going to be like, we're going to stand our ground here and, we don't need you back. It wasn't really any of that. And it can't be that. The Nets can't really take that direction with Kyrie Irving for a lot of different reasons at this point. So when Sean Marks comes at the end of the season and does talk about availability and talks about, like I said, players that want to be there for all the same reasons, he didn't mention, they did mention Kyrie Irving name by name a few times, but not like with that specific sentence. But it did feel kind of pointed at Kyrie, maybe a little Ben Simmons too, depending on how they felt that situation had played out at the end of the season. And I think it was a little bit at the time with Marks, it was a little bit of, hey, like kind of, let's just take the reins back here a little bit. Maybe we've gotten this season one a little out of control with, who was available and who wasn't, and who is leading the team and who wasn't. Because if you remember Kyrie Irving's, one of his last comments of the season following the loss and the sweep to the Celtics was the comment around how going into the future, he had planned to resign and he planned to come back to the Nets, and how it was going to be him and Kevin Durant and Sean Marks and Joe Tsai, managing the organization going forward. We all kind of gave a little side glance at that comment at the time, but it was a little off the cuff. Kyrie Irving is sort of notorious for saying some of this stuff, and then sometimes he walks it back, sometimes doesn't over the course of his career. But when he makes that comment, everyone's kind of like, hey, that's a little bit of an odd thing to say. Didn't include Steve Nash in it, by the way. But, a little bit of an odd thing to say for Kyrie in terms of where he viewed himself in terms of the organizational hierarchy. And then for Sean Marks to come out and basically, not give that really any time of the day during his final press conference. In fact, go to the opposite direction and sort of question whether or not, who was going to be back. I do think some of the messaging was purposeful there, and not to have it be so standoffish to say it's going to be, we can't reconcile some of these differences, or we can't come to the negotiating table and talk about what each side needs to do, or what the Nets feel like Kyrie Irving needs to do going forward to be part of the organization in the way that the Nets brass feel like he should. But I think it was more just sort of like balancing the ledger a little bit, getting those scales balanced, making sure to say, hey, you, Kyrie Irving, you're not, maybe in some ways you are, but you're not part of this managerial process. In fact, we are the managers of this organization, and we are going to negotiate and decide who is going to be part of our team going forward. But even with all that, even with some of this, sideline kind of comments and whatnot, it still always was going to make the most sense for Kyrie Irving to return to the Brooklyn Nets for financial reasons, for basketball reasons, really for relationship reasons, Kevin Durant. Really, there was all of the other stuff always lined up with Kyrie coming back, because it just wasn't going to make any sense. That replacing him and his skill was going to be impossible. The Nets were not going to be able to do it definitely not via free agency. Very difficult to do it via sign and trade. And I don't think any of that was possible. We know him and Kevin Durant are friends. Something about the organizational marching orders at this point feel like they need to be about keeping Kevin Durant happy, over the course of his contract. I think that's a realistic thing. I don't think that's placating the superstars or anything like that. You want your best players to be happy. I think that makes sense. It shouldn't become at the detriment of your overall organization, but you still would like to keep your best employees should always be the happiest. That's any organization. And I think his relationship with Kevin Durant, warranted that piece of it being true. And obviously Kyrie's a great basketball player too. When he plays, he's one of the best that there is on the basketball court. So all this other stuff makes sense. I want to go through what some of the options, as reported by these guys, by Brian Lewis and some others, about what some of the options are that for Kyrie Irving, what it maybe means for the team if they just can lock this in to place sooner than later, and then kind of go on their way in terms of just making, fitting in the rest of the pieces. Do want to talk about all that. Of course, first going to tell you about our friends over at Sakara. Look, feeling your best starts with what you eat. Sakara helps you live a healthy and balanced lifestyle so you can truly enjoy it. They have delicious, plant-rich, transformational nutrition that builds a foundation for living your best body. It's a time to seek wellness, joy, and abundance in all areas of your life, starting with what you eat. With Sakara, you get nutrient-dense meals, snacks, and supplements that nourish your body without ever sacrificing taste or quality. Look, looking and feeling your best shouldn't mean deprivation. You don't want to go without. You want to make sure you're putting things in your body that make sense. You want to choose joy. You want to choose abundance. They have organic, plant-rich programs that are designed to help you cultivate body intelligence. Sakara is a wellness company anchored in food as medicine on a mission to nourish your body through the power of plants. They have plant-rich ingredients to help you boost your energy, support your digestion, curb your sugar cravings, and get your skin glowing. Right now, Sakara is offering our listeners 20% off their first order when they go to sakara.com/locked-on20. That's you have to enter that code locked-on20 at checkout. Locked On, like our podcast network, 20 for the 20% you're going to get off. That's Sakara, sakara.com/locked-on20 to get 20% off your first order. Sakara.com/locked-on20. Okay, so if Kyrie Irving, however you want to kind of say that, ends up re-signing with the Brooklyn Nets, what could it look like? So in the Brian Lewis reporting, there was consultation with some cap experts. One of those guys was Bobby Marks. We know he works for ESPN, ex-Net front office guy. So there's, a lot of expertise around salary cap that you can just go seek out when it comes to just the the strict numbers and what guys are available. And, after they've been in the league a certain amount of time and all this other stuff, the accolades they've received. There's all these different benchmarks for where you can go in terms of getting contracts. So there's a couple different options. One interesting thing before we get to the straight up numbers is one piece of speculation was that Kyrie Irving would sign a number that looked around like where he's getting right now. So his opt-in player option for the 22-23 season is at 36.5 million, a little bit of change, but let's just call it that 36.5. He just should have made around 35 million last season, but we know he forewent a lot of his salary when he did not get the vaccine and then could not meet the requirements for the COVID-19. So he forfeited all of those home game checks during that time. But if his player option, if you were to take it in, that'd be 36.5 million for that year. And then there's like some ways to go about it. So one of the pieces of speculation was that the Nets would sign him for somewhere in this ballpark of 37 million. Let's round it up a little bit. We'll say 37 million, and then attach a bunch of different incentives to the rest of the money that could increase it by something like 15%, which you can do in terms of incentives. And then that would get him somewhere like in that $42 million range, like per year, if he were to meet all the incentives. So why would the Nets want to put incentives in place? Well, I think the reasons are kind of obvious. So the incentives would be around a games played, which I would always question around how much the players union wants that kind of stuff to happen. Obviously, when it related to injury, those things can't be helped. But, when you're negotiating contracts, putting in pieces around these kinds of incentives sometimes can get a little tricky. And there's reasons why I would think and feel that the union or any labor organization would be worried about beginning to walk down that path too much with their players. Just because from an organizational labor movement, it can get a little hairy in terms of the motivations for not playing or why you can't play, or, if the teams are going to start using incentives to their advantage to kind of save money by sidelining guys, blah, yada, yada, yada. There's a million reasons from a labor organization standpoint that you really would want to avoid this piece of incentive. But if that was going to be the case, to add in these escalators on incentives around games played for Kyrie Irving, if they did that somewhere to the tune of 15%, then, and maybe they said it's like 60 games or 50 games or whatever it's going to be that he had to make sure that he was on the court for. If they were able to do that, then the number starts to get close to that max-ish contract of 42 million, which is a little bit south of what the max is. And look, we know players they're human beings, right? They want to make the most. We're all like this. There's nobody, go find me the person that doesn't want to maximize what they make and whatever their job is. And then especially as it's compared to their peers, who they probably, especially if you feel like you're better than your peers, you want to make more because it's a sign of status. It's a sign of that your skills are valued, that what you bring to the organization is valued. And I know for many people, me included, most people, the ideas around, what's the difference of 37 million and 42 million? It's many, many tens of millions more than I have. I get that. I totally understand that line of thinking and why people would sometimes scoff at the idea of an extra 7 million, because most people won't make that. A lot of people won't make that in a lifetime. So to throw, some negativity around, why wouldn't you just take this money if they're offering it? Or, why would you hold out? I think it's kind of obvious, because all you have to do is remove the millions and just say, hey, when it's compared to my peers in a job, or it's compared to my skill set, or compared to what I can do, compared to what others can do, or compared to how important I am for the organization, then every dollar counts. And the million, or, if it's 1,000, 100,000, a million, or a billion, like if these are the numbers we're talking about and your peers and others in the organization make this kind of stuff, then I don't think we should begin to be the folks that say, oh, what's another 7 million or whatever. So, and from a Kyrie Irving standpoint, it makes sense that he would want to extract every piece of value out of a contract, because he believes in his skill set and he believes what he does on the court is, unrivaled by many, many other basketball players. So I'm not going to see a situation where Kyrie Irving is just going to settle for, even with all the stuff that's happened, even with, the COVID stuff, even with sitting out games, even with, getting dragged through the media at times, even with all this other stuff. Is there a world where Kyrie Irving doesn't feel like his value is at the highest it can be? You can't, it's hard to be a professional athlete operating at this level and not think this about yourself. So I don't think he's just going to come to this table and just be willing to agree on just any lowball number. But if you look at it in a world where, okay, hey, the player option is 37, you can get up to 42. These are kind of like, max-ish numbers. You got to, there were some playing time concerns. I think the Nets would be remiss to not at least bring that up in a negotiation. If they can attach the incentives to that piece of it, and then eventually you go through a whole season and you play, and it's a regular season, and that's just the way it is, and you play 65 games or whatever, because that's kind of like the new normal in basketball. If you play 65, 70 games, if you feel like you got a full season when guys play that much. I think at that point that both sides can probably look across the table at each other and say, hey, this seems fair. This seems pretty equitable. This is representative of my skill. It's representative of a little uncertainty that has occurred over those last couple of years. But when it's all said and done, if I'm playing at my peak and you are committed to having me on the court, then there's no reason that these numbers can't reach close to the max. So the other couple just sort of just kind of shopkeeping and just, looking at the ledger of what those options are. So a couple that were outlined in the article. One is that Kyrie Irving could still opt in to this season, that $36.5 million player option. He could still opt into that contract and then sign a 4-year extension with Brooklyn worth, the number here is 189.7 million. Let's just call it 190 million. That would take him through, that would actually put him, beyond where Kevin Durant's contract is if he signed that for an extra 4 years, because Kevin Durant, remember, his last year of his contract is 25-26, and opt-in plus 4 would put Kyrie Irving at 26-27. So that's one option. Another option is he opts out and he would still be eligible for a 5-year, $245.6 million deal with the Nets. It averages out to around $49 million a year. That's what he's eligible for. Again, under this reporting, I think the agreement would sort of be that this is not going to be the number, but we're going to incentivize you to kind of start getting close to the number. So those are kind of the two options at the max that he's looking at. Look, do we see a situation where they sort of time his contract with Kevin Durant's, something like opt out and then you get a 4-year contract? That would put him in line with where Kevin Durant is now. It will put both of them on the same exact timeline. I'm not sure if those two guys look at this with each other and say, this is kind of our goal, is to be on the same timeline as each other. It's not exactly the case, because Kevin Durant signed a long-term contract and Kyrie Irving didn't. So, it's hard to say that for sure that's what the 100% plan is, because one did something and the other didn't. But we know they're friends and we know that these things probably are important to them. So I wouldn't be surprised if if the timeline ended up being sometime around the same number. So it looks like that's what they're looking at in terms of numbers and probably years and incentives. Again, this is all reporting coming from one source, but if you just kind of do the old doesn't make sense test on yourself, I think all this makes total sense. This kind of was always around where we were speculating things would sort of go with Kyrie Irving. So I think all of this stuff, it makes sense. Like you kind of nod your head slowly and say, okay, I can see what this means. This feels like the thing that was always going to happen. It has not happened yet, but this makes sense on everything I sort of understand around the situation. Talk a little bit more about what Kyrie Irving re-signing with the Nets will and could mean here in a second. We got to tell you about our friends over at betonline.net, which is your number one source for all of your sports betting needs, stats, and info. BetOnline has all the latest developments. They have all the news. They have all the odds. I'm over there on BetOnline every single day right now I'm looking at baseball odds, seeing how those lines are moving. Great for that. Great for all the other sports as well. They got the NBA stuff still going. NHL, we're rolling through the playoffs over there. MLB, like I just mentioned, maybe you want to tune into the fight nights on the weekends. I got MMA and UFC boxing as well. BetOnline is your continued source for all that sports wagering information. They got the live betting if you want to get into that as well. That can be sometimes fun in-game. You head on over to betonline.net. You can learn about all the trends, all the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Okay, Adam and I spoke yesterday about just sort of the pieces that the Nets needed in terms of winning a championship, like what you need as an organization now to think that you have championship equity, to think that you are on a championship trajectory, to like compare yourself to the other best teams in the league. And what we kind of mentioned, posited, hypothesized is that, based on what's happening sort of around the NBA this season, specifically in the finals, is that there is no one clear recipe to win the championship. We talked to how, Boston and Golden State are built very, very differently from each other. They have two just totally different sets of strategies and, kind of what they're trying to do on the basketball court on a game-to-game basis. They operate very, very differently from each other. Both are in the hunt for the championship right now. We said that whoever wins, Golden State or Boston, will not change my mind that there's no one right way to do this thing. Both these teams are close enough now. They've looked equally enough matched. I know I'm saying this before game 3. Even if one team won the next 3 games, I'm not sure how much my opinion would really change. Maybe a little bit, like if there was total blowouts, but I don't think so. So if you look at those two teams and you go back and listen to what we talked about with this, you can, I think, begin to agree that there's no correct one static build for the exact kind of player combination of players that you need to win the championship in basketball. What you need is a top 10 player, probably at least, hopefully even higher, like top 5, if you can get there. And then you need, an excellent supporting cast that complements each other really well. And bringing back Kyrie Irving, if they were to re-sign this contract and commit long-term, and we had full buy-in from all parties around, what this is going to look like going into the future, we still have to put the Nets on this championship timeline. We have to put them on the championship trajectory. When you have talent like Kevin Durant, like Kyrie Irving, yes, you will need to get specific kinds of other players to complement their skills. It doesn't always have to be the exact kinds of guys. We talked about how they added James Harden to this mix and it looked amazing, right? They can add other pieces. Like these guys are so versatile that you can add different kinds of pieces. They don't always have to be the exact kind of build, but we know that these guys, with their talent level, with their ability to score, if we can get some X's and O's and scheme, buying on scheme stuff, kind of rolling with Nash and company and whoever they have end up sitting on the bench next season. That's, by the way, something we'll talk about in a future episode is some of this other coaching staff turnover that they continue to have going into next year. But when you have these two guys already on your team, you just have to put yourself at least in the conversation. It's crazy if you didn't. It's crazy to have Kevin Durant on your team and not put yourself in the conversation. It's crazy to pair Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant together and not be in the conversation for the championship. Those guys are too good. So then it becomes, what do you add around them? Well, we talked about how Ben Simmons, if we get a version of Ben Simmons that was like 2 seasons ago, non-playoff Ben Simmons, that's a kind of a perfect complementary piece. We talked about how, hey, we want to throw some money at Nick Claxton here in this offseason. That's a piece that we know can already work with these guys. We've seen it. He played, I thought, quality playoff minutes against the Celtics. I know it was a disaster at the free throw line, but I think that he more than held his own, and he continues to get better season over season. So I think that Nets fans as much turmoil as there's been with Kyrie Irving over the last couple of years, and as much as the disappointment around the Celtics thing happened this season, and as much craziness as around Ben Simmons, I think still, and you're going to not hear this, it's going to be funny how this is reported from a national media perspective if Kyrie Irving signs a long-term contract. I think that the sort of like the way the wind will blow is that the Nets are nuts for doing it. I can kind of see that. I can see that a little bit. I can see that the Kyrie Irving situation hasn't played out 100% perfectly over these first 3 years. I can see that part. But I think at some point you just need to just go all in on talent and kind of hope it works out, and keeping your superstars happy and or Kevin Durant happy. And that's just like, if that's where you are as an organization right now, there's no place to pivot anyway. So you just have to keep doing this. Now, will some people say that's throwing good money after bad? Yes, maybe, but Kyrie Irving's too good to like go all the way with that. It's just like the talent. The only reason we still keep talking about it or still keep questioning about it or still like the reason he's still so relevant when it comes to just national media stuff is because he's so good, right? Like other guys don't get, people frothy and rabid around, what they're doing when they're not good. They just don't care. Like, name any basketball player basically outside of a small group of superstars. Very rarely do they get anyone kind of ginned up around how, upset they're going to get. It only happens when the players are really, really good or like maybe dirty. Other than those two things, or I guess maybe like there's superstar potential there and they just do nothing. I guess those are the kind of three examples of the kind of player that gets people totally nuts. But the reason Kyrie Irving gets certain selections of the media nuts is, one, they know talking about him is going to kind of, get ratings. So that one, you don't have to do too much calculus when it comes to that. But two, it's just because he's so good. It's because when you see him come back from the COVID stuff, when they finally decide to bring him for those road games and the guy just is right back in the saddle like nothing ever even happened. He came really, I know he wouldn't have been eligible from the amount of games played, but he was butting up against 50, 40, 90 again this season, was completely just ice cold and red hot, ice cold, whatever, ice water in the veins when it came to the mid range. If you just look at the shot chart, as we know from watching him, it's just kind of elite at all levels of scoring. He can get to the hoop. He's got the handle that was just among the very best ever. Like, we know all this stuff. The reason people get crazy about him is because he's so good, and it's just been sort of weird and frustrating at times. But if you're the Nets, you have to push your chips in here with this because of all the stuff we talked about before. You can't replace the talent. There's no way. You can't possibly replace the happiness with Kevin Durant. There's just no way. If their friendship is reported to be as it is, and all signs, podcast visits and hanging out and all this other stuff, all signs point to that being the case. So at that point, you just have to do this thing. I don't think that's being like apologetic for the Nets. And I don't think it's making an excuse for where the Brooklyn Nets are. It just is what it is at this point. And is it like maybe the 100% ideal situation? No, but the alternatives just really aren't there either. So this was all, like I said from the beginning, this has been pointed in this direction. I think we knew we were getting this way. I think we knew that Kyrie Irving was going to sign this deal. I think probably all we're trying to figure out now is the length of the contract, where the money stands, what's going to cost them in tax. That we already know they're over the luxury cap tax and they're into the tax. I think those pieces will be sort of mildly interesting. I think mostly for me, the most interesting thing will be the years. And then if there are incentives, like those will be the two things that we want to look out for the most going forward around where those two things land. But the idea around the signing the contract is not that surprising. I don't think we as Nets folks can really be all surprised that is going to be the way that things go. That's just where it's been pointed at really with Kyrie Irving since the beginning of the offseason. All right, we are going to be back as long as there's no other crazy Nets news dropping over the next couple of days. There's a really cool article that went through trade value for all NBA players and kind of a ranking where the trade value landed for everybody in the NBA. Adam and I really wanted to get into it because it's a pretty cool thing. It's a nice discussion piece around where some of these Nets guys were ranked: Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons specifically, where they ranked in terms of trade value by, an independent source that's just trying to come up with some of this stuff. I found the list to be, I mostly agreed with most of it, but I would be interested to hear what Adam thinks about it too. So we'll go over that over the next couple of days. talk about where our Nets guys land in the list. Like I said at the beginning, thanks for making us your first listen. Free, available on all podcast platforms. Make sure you like and subscribe there. Make sure you hit subscribe on YouTube as well. A million comments in from yesterday's podcast. Really appreciated all the discussion that came up over talking about some of our championship pieces. Really cool. Make sure, please go subscribe over to YouTube. Love to get to 3,000 during this off season. We're sitting around 2,500 right now. So I think we're going to make it be part of that movement. Also, Adam's usually the good one with the quote. So I will skip over the quote here at the end of it and just say, we'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.